Now, tonight we have two special guests, Al Roth and his wife, Emily. And Al is the Craig and Susan McCaw Professor at Stanford. We're very proud to have him. Al and Emily kind of traveled through the wilderness for a while. He got his PhD at Stanford. But after, I guess it was EES at the time, or what? Operations Research, which is part of the engineering school, but had a lot of economics content in it. And then he went to the University of Illinois. Then he went to the University of Pittsburgh. Then he went to Harvard. And then he went to Stanford, and we like to think, and I hope I don't insult Illinois, but we like to think he upgraded every move. And so glad that he did that. Just as he arrived, essentially, he won the 2012 Nobel Prize in economics, and so that was affirmation that we had done a good thing in bringing him back to Stanford. He's the second Nobel Prize winner, as far as I know, at Stanford, Kenneth Arrow being the other. Tonight, he's going to talk about market design and school choice, which is closely related to the work that he won the Nobel Prize for. But I would say, if you look at his accomplishments, they're amazing. But what I find refreshing is just how nice and fun and friendly he is. And Katie and I are really happy that Emily and Al are going to be our neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's very nice to be here. My late parents were both high school teachers, and I went to high school in New York City, and so it was exciting when, is that better? Can you hear me? It was exciting when I got asked to help design the school choice system for high schools in New York City. And that story has a lot of parts to it, and I'll tell you some of them. But one of the parts that I won't enlarge on too much is it took me a while to graduate from high school, but I finally did, at least in an honorary way, this year. So let me tell you about why economists are interested in school choice and why that's a natural kind of thing, because you may not think of school choice and how we allocate places in public schools as a marketplace, because we don't use money to decide who gets what public school places. But it turns out markets are a wider class of things than you might ordinarily consider. So first of all, think about market design, because market design is an ancient human activity. But because markets are so pervasive, we think of them a little bit like language. Markets and languages are both human artifacts, but we don't think of languages as something we can change. They're just something we get. I speak to you in English, and I have to speak to you in the same kind of English that you speak, otherwise it wouldn't work. And often we think of markets that way too, that markets just happen. But of course, markets are human artifacts, and market design is the engineering part of microeconomics. It's the part that lets us sometimes fix markets when they're broken, or make new ones sometimes. And just as there are lots of different natural languages, there's English and French and Portuguese, there are also lots of different kinds of markets. And in not all of them does money play the central role that it plays in commodity markets. So let's think about that for a little bit and think about what's the role of money in markets, because I'm going to talk to you today about a market where money doesn't play a role. So if you go to the New York Stock Exchange, you're in a commodity market. All the shares of American Telephone and Telegraph Company are the same as all the other shares. It's a real commodity. And when you buy shares in the stock market, you don't care who you're dealing with. You don't care whether they took good care of those shares while they had them. They don't care whether you're going to take good care of those shares. The only thing you have to do is find an agreeable price, and the job of the stock exchange is to find that price. The job of the stock exchange is price discovery. Find a price at which supply equals demand. But lots of markets don't work that way. Think about Stanford. We don't fill our freshman class by raising tuition until supply equals demand, until there are just enough kids who want to enter the freshman class. It's expensive to go to Stanford, but it's cheap enough so that lots of people would like to go. And so we have an admissions office, that we have all these other institutions to clear the market that select who gets to come to Stanford. And similarly, not just college admissions, but labor markets are like that too, right? We don't hire our professors by lowering the wage until just enough people want to teach economics, right? Lots of people would like to teach economics here. So administrators are a different story. So matching markets are markets where you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it. You also have to be chosen. Okay, so you can't just decide you're coming to Stanford, you have to be admitted. You can't just decide you're going to work for Google, you have to be hired. And in the same way, Stanford can't just decide who's going to come to Stanford. We have to compete with Illinois. And Google can't just decide who's going to come work at Google. They have to compete with Facebook. So matching markets have a lot of other institutions than just institutions to find prices. So I'm going to tell you about school choice systems today, but I've been involved in a couple of different kinds of market design. And school choice systems, what they have in common with, say, kidney exchange, Emily and I were just at the World Transplant Congress in San Francisco, is school places and public schools and kidneys, we don't allow prices to play a role at all. But labor markets, prices play an important role, but still they don't decide who gets what. Lots of people make pretty much the same wages, so it's not the wages that decide who works at Stanford and who works at Illinois. There are other things that go into that. So that's the large view on why, to an economist, school choice looks like a market. We're going to be allocating scarce resources, and we want to allocate them efficiently. The thing that you don't like in school choice is that your kid goes to the school that would really be good for my kid, while my kid is occupying the last spot in the school that would be really good for your kid. So some school choice procedures, I'll tell you about some, are easy to describe, but hard for families to navigate. Others may be harder to describe, but easy to navigate. I'm going to tell you about how we helped change some hard-to-navigate systems to some easy-to-navigate systems. And when you're designing an allocation process like school choice, you have to remember that a lot of the participants aren't experienced actors in this market. They're going to be families whose kids just got old enough for kindergarten. Those are your customers. On the other side of the market, there may be experienced professionals, principals of schools who do this every year, or the school district. And the goal is to get kids into school efficiently. It would be great in some of these cities I'll tell you about if all the schools were good, but they're not all good. The reason we're interested in school choice is when you send kids to their local schools, kids who live in poor neighborhoods are often condemned to go to poor schools. And this exacerbates intergenerational poverty, which is something that we're not good at thinking about that we have in America, but that we don't like to have. But even though you've got these scarce resources, not all the schools may be equally good. What's really wasteful, again, is that there are kids who could have been in different schools and both done better. So you'd like to assign kids to schools in a way that isn't wasteful. And we're going to work on the idea that the parents have some valuable information about what would be a good school for their kids. So I'm going to tell you about New York City and Boston. My colleagues and I have also worked now in a number of other cities. And the difference, incidentally, the reason New York City and Boston are interesting cases to compare is that in New York, the school principals are very active players. And in Boston, they're not. In Boston, the school district, Boston Public Schools, does all the allocation, and the principals just run the schools. So let me tell you about the old Boston system, though, because when we got to New York, which I'll tell you about, it was chaotic, and they just needed help in having an orderly system as well as a good one. But in Boston, they already had a system of school choice in place and had for a number of years. And it was simple to describe, but it was hard to navigate. So they had what I'll call an immediate acceptance system. And the way they ran school choice in Boston was that each student had a priority at each school based on whether you had an older child already in that school, so a child with an older sib in a school had priority, a kid who lived in the walk zone had priority for some seats, and then there was a lottery that was a tiebreaker for cases where there were more children interested in places than there were places. And the big entering grades were kindergarten 6 and 9, and families with children entering those grades submitted preference lists. Here's our first choice school, here's our second choice, here's our third choice. And then the school district did what sounds simple and benign. They said, subject to the priorities, using the priorities as tiebreakers when we need to, we're going to give as many people as we can their first choice. And after if some school has more applicants as its first choice than we can fit, then we'll order them in order of priorities and keep as many as we can and reject the rest. We'll give as many people as possible their first choice. And when we've done that, we'll then look at who's left and we'll give as many of them as possible their second choice. And when we've done that, we'll look at who's left and we'll give as many as possible their third choice. So that sounds pretty nice. But it presents families with the following problem. If you fail to get into the school that you said was your first choice, there's a good chance that the school that you said was your second choice is going to have all its places filled with people who said it was their first choice. So if you don't get your first choice, you might drop all the way through the bottom of your list and end up in a school that still had vacant places after everyone had gotten their first and second and third choices. Right? So it's dangerous. It's a kind of Russian roulette where you win big or you lose bad. So that's what's wrong with a system like this. It's not safe for families to list their true preferences, because if you don't get the school you rank first, you might not get a good school at all. Whereas if you had ranked, say, your second choice school first, you might have gotten in. Right? So supposing you live across from the Linden Kindergarten, which is one of the best kindergartens, and so your child has walk zone priority. They reserve that for half their places. There's a good chance that if you listed it as your first choice, you would get in. But you would like a full-day kindergarten. So your real first choice, the one that you could have if you could have whatever you wanted, is one that you don't have a high priority for. But if you take a chance on that and ask for it and don't get it, you won't get the neighborhood school either that you like a lot, because you live near a very good neighborhood school. So it's not even safe for you to tell the school district what schools you would like. So you can already see that it's going to be hard for them to give you a school that would be good for your kid if you can't even tell them which school would be good. And they knew this. So when you looked at the brochures, when you looked at the things that they sent home in backpack mail, it would say, for a better chance of your first choice school, consider choosing less popular schools. You know? And some of the parents' groups were very sophisticated about this. And the West Zone parents, so Jamaica Plains, for those of you who know Boston, they had a sophisticated group of parents that gathered lots of intelligence. So particularly at kindergarten, they knew before Boston Public Schools knew just how many children with older siblings were going to be applying for kindergarten. You know, this is information you can collect in the playgrounds, but the school district doesn't see the children until they apply. And what they would do is they would compile this information, and that would allow them to figure out what the chances were of getting into each kindergarten. And it's easier to gather that information for 6th and 9th grade. But they sort of say one school choice strategy is to find a school you like that's undersubscribed and make that your top choice, or find a school that you like that's popular and put it as a first choice, but then find a school that is less popular for a safe second choice. That means as a second choice, you need to put a school that won't fill up with people's first choices. So it has to be quite a bit less popular. So that's complicated strategizing. And of course, not every family could do this strategizing, or was interested, or spoke English at home, or knew how to use the websites of the schools to figure out what the reading scores were and how quickly they had filled in previous years. So almost a fifth of families made what were clearly strategic mistakes, in that they would list as their second choice a popular school that no one had ever gotten into as a second choice. So you could tell that they were coming to harm by doing what the school district said to them that they should do, which is tell us what's your first choice, what's your second choice, what's your third choice. Okay, so it's costly to have a system that makes it unsafe to reveal your preferences. One of the costs is, since it's not safe to tell the school district what your preferences are, you tell them something else. You have to concentrate on saying that your first choice is a school that you think you could get. So that makes it hard for them to do planning. Supposing we change some of the lines for the school districts in which you could choose among schools, what would happen? Well, you don't know what would happen because you don't know where people want their kids to go. You just know where they think they can get their kids in under the old system. And there were, of course, costs to parents. There were costs to the parents who didn't understand the system. Those costs were clear. But when we set about fixing this, we thought that maybe the sophisticated parents would like the old system. It sort of gave them an advantage that other parents didn't necessarily have. Turns out they hated the old system. Gathering the information was very costly. They much more wanted to spend their time figuring out which schools would be good for their kids, which kindergarten teachers were good with shy boys or whatever problem you had to solve in your family, and not figure out instead which schools were popular and unpopular and were likely to be full and not. So I'm going to tell you how we fixed that. But it turns out the solution is similar to what we did in New York City, which had a different set of problems. So let me tell you about the problems that faced New York City, because theirs were quite different. Boston had an orderly system that wasn't working very well. But it wasn't completely obvious that it wasn't working very well. When my colleagues and I were talking about this kind of stuff, we said to ourselves, Boston was like a patient with high blood pressure. It's a dangerous disease, but you don't feel the symptoms right away. You have to be convinced that you have a dangerous disease. New York was like a heart attack. They knew they were in trouble because so New York's a big municipal school district. There are 1.2 million children in schools in New York, public schools, and 90,000 of them a year, 87,000, go to ninth grade. So that's the group that we were going to deal with. When I speak to groups, especially in New York, I emphasize that we only handled school choice for high schools. The school choice for kindergartens and elementary schools and middle schools is a mess, but it's not our mess. But what they were doing is they had a semi-centralized system. This is in 2003 when Mayor Bloomberg had just become mayor. And the city had used to have a system of community school boards, and he was trying to reassert central city control so that children could choose from any of the 600 some odd high school programs in New York. And the way they did it in New York was if you were in 8th grade, getting ready to go to 9th grade, you were invited to submit a rank order list of 5 schools that you would like to go to. And that list was then Xeroxed and sent to the schools, and that constituted your application to those schools. So there's a couple of things that make that complicated, but one of them is the school doesn't just know that you applied, they see your list. So they look at you and they say, little Jeffy here wants to come and we're his third choice. The hell with that. We're only going to admit kids who list us as their first choice, for instance. That was something that schools often said. So you can see that in a very different way, they're going to have the same kind of problem. One of the problems they're going to have is the same kind of problem that Boston had, which is it may not be safe to indicate your first choice because when you indicate your first choice, you also have to say what school's your second choice, and that might offend your second choice and not let them, not make them want to let you in. And the schools often, when you talk to the principals, they thought they had very good reasons for doing this. So New York has a lot of high schools. Some of them are specialized. So there's a high school called Aviation High School. It's in Queens. It's between LaGuardia and Kennedy. It's a sort of vocational high school, and they, although many children go on to college, but they like airports. A lot of their kids work for the airports or for airlines. And you could imagine being the principal of a school like that thinking, I'm only going to admit kids who really like Aviation High School, and they'll indicate that by listing it first. But of course, on the other side of that, you think to yourself, supposing Aviation High School is my second choice. my first choice is Townsend Harris High School on the campus of Queens College, a public school that's hard to get into and a very good school. You say, what's the chance I'm going to get into Townsend Harris? And if I don't, then I won't get into aviation either because they only admit you when you list them first. So a lot of the people who end up listing aviation first, it wasn't because they had a passion for airlines, it's because aviation is a high school that they thought they could get into if they listed it as their first choice. And of course, when you invite people to list 5 choices, but a handful of those choices won't even look at you if you don't list them first, you're really just inviting them to make 1 or 2 choices. And what that meant was, well, so I have to tell you another problem, but what it meant was each year 30,000 kids, a bunch of kids, had to be assigned to high schools that they hadn't listed anywhere from their choices. Partly it's because they had fewer choices than they seemed, and partly it was because the system was congested. They ran it through the mail. So they Xerox your high school application, they send it to the schools. The schools decide who to admit, send that information to New York City Department of Education, to the district. District sends out a letter to students, and it says, congratulations, you've been admitted to the following 3 high schools. Okay? 17,000 out of 90,000, 17,000 students were admitted to multiple high schools. What that means, of course, on the first letter, what that means, of course, is many students weren't admitted to any high schools on the first letter. They were just on waiting lists, is what their letter said. But if you were admitted to high schools, what your letter said was, congratulations, you've been admitted to 3 high schools. Please choose one of them. And if in addition you want to be on the waiting list of some high school, you're also on some waiting list, choose that and send us through the mail a letter. Well, you've got to think about these things. So it takes a while for the mail to go back and forth. Then they had time to send another letter like that. Once you've chosen some high schools, there are some new places that have opened up, and high schools that admitted you but didn't get you can now admit some more students. Another round of letters went out, had to be considered and sent back. They had time for 3 rounds of letters. And late in August, they administratively assigned 30,000 students. This made people very unhappy. So that's what I mean when I say they felt like they were having a heart attack. They knew they had to do something, that they were trying to have school choice, but 30,000 kids were being assigned very late. And in addition, one of the reasons they had trouble filling was principals could conceal places. It turns out that it was a really decentralized system, and it had been decentralized for a long time. And if you were the principal of a school that had, some kind of infrastructure, you could say some classrooms were being renovated and things like that, and that you had to admit a smaller 9th grade class than you were used to. And then you'd discover these extra spaces because they were going to be these 30,000 unassigned kids. And it would be nice to, rather than have them randomly assigned to you, to be able to choose the ones you wanted and negotiate with them. So they were finding that a lot of the places never even got put into the centralized system. And of course, as parents had come to understand this, a lot of the children never were put into the centralized system. And there were lots of children showing up at schools where they hadn't actually been assigned. And that was part of how New York City worked. So it was an opaque, complicated system that nevertheless didn't work very well. So incidentally, New York City schools, I should mention, and I could say some of the same things about Boston schools, are pretty complicated. They had different kinds of schools. So they had schools that were unscreened, that had to admit by lottery. In these days, I'm not yet talking about charter schools, but nowadays when we talk to school districts, we're often trying to integrate charter schools and district schools together into a one application process. But many of the charter schools, of course, also are unscreened. But then they had specialized high schools and test high schools. New York City has a lot of high schools. But there was a big group of what were called educational option schools, which had a lot of rules about what kind of students they could have. And in particular, they had to admit half their students by lottery, and half they could have preferences over, but they had to have a bell curve of reading scores. So they had to have 68% of kids with what were called middle grades on 7th grade standardized reading test, 16% with high grades, 16% with low grades. So there were details that had to be taken care of. And the object was to, in both cases, New York City was a couple of years earlier, the object was to redesign the school choice to deal with congestion. You know, one of the things that made New York a hard system was 90,000 kids. You had to process their preferences and assign them all. You wanted to, in both places, make it safe for families to reveal their true preferences, and you wanted to assign students to places efficiently in ways that weren't wasteful, while meeting the objectives that the school district had, like having a mix of students in educational option schools. So let me tell you basically what we did. And I'm going to tell you about an algorithm that, I don't know if John mentioned that when I won the Nobel Prize in 2012, I shared it. I shared it with a man named Lloyd Shapley. And he had written a paper with David Gale, who was no longer living when we won the prize. And I'm basically going to tell you about what was in their paper and the big thing that they won the prize for. So I'm going to tell you about a way to put children into schools and a little bit about it. And there are some deep ideas here. So let me see if I can tell you about them. Okay, so we're going to change the New York City school system, and we're going to change the Boston school choice system. And what we're going to do is we're going to have them both outwardly look like Boston did. So not New York with preferences going back and forth through the mails, but like Boston, families are going to submit preference lists. In New York, schools will submit preference lists. In Boston, the school district will just assign priorities at each school for each child, and those will look like preference lists. And then we're going to process that information through a computer quickly. That'll help deal with congestion. And assign students to schools. So the actions that people take are they submit preference lists. They say, what's your first choice, what's your second, what's your third. Everything else that I'm about to describe to you goes on inside the computer. Okay, so what happens when we get those preference lists? Well, first, each student applies to her first choice school. Okay, so far it's the way Boston started. But now, each school doesn't immediately accept the students who have applied to it up to its capacity. Instead, each school tentatively assigns its seats to its applicants one at a time in their priority order. And any remaining applicants, more than its capacity, are rejected. But the students who were not rejected are not yet accepted. That's why this is called a deferred acceptance algorithm. You could also call it a tentative acceptance algorithm. Because right now at that first choice, when the computer just sees the first choices, no students are assigned to any schools yet, although some students are definitely told that they can't be assigned to their first choice. There were just too many applicants. Okay, so what happens when the students who can't be assigned to their first choice are told that? Well, they apply to their second choice. And the schools now look at all the students who have applied, the ones who were tentatively held so far, and the new ones, orders them in order of priority or in order of their preferences, if it's New York City, tentatively accept as many as they can and reject the rest. So in particular, the schools don't know when you applied, whether you applied as your first choice or your second choice. They look at all the applicants, they order them in terms of their priorities, they hold as many as they can and reject the rest. And at each subsequent stage of the algorithm, any student who's been rejected applies to his next choice school. The schools look at all the students who've applied so far, keep the ones they can, reject the rest. And the algorithm stops only when no student wants to apply anymore, when a student has either been accepted, been held, but not been rejected yet at one of the schools to which she applied, or perhaps has been rejected by every school to which she applied. Okay, and at that point, the tentative acceptances become final. They're deferred to the end of the algorithm when no one's making any more applications.
So all these rounds are just in the computer?
In the computer. So there's two things that are fast. One is computers are fast. The other is because families submit preferences, they've made the decisions they have to make beforehand. They don't have to get the letter, consult with family and friends and favorite teachers, and decide which of the schools they've been accepted to they should accept. They've already made that decision and said, if I'm accepted to these, this is my first choice, this is my second, this is my third. Okay, so it goes very fast. You can run New York City on a laptop in 20 minutes. Okay, now it has the property that principals can no longer get better students by withholding places. Let's think about that a little bit. Supposing I'm a principal in New York City, and when I finally look at my assignment of students, I say, you know, there are some students who I would rather have had than the ones I've got. Maybe I should have withheld some places to try to get them. Why is that not going to be true when you organize school choice this way? Well, if there are some students I would prefer to have than ones I've got, it means that if they had applied to me, I would have kept them and not the ones I've got. So they never applied to me. So why didn't they apply to me? Well, they first applied to their first choice, then their second choice. They got accepted somewhere before they got to me. So the students who I might prefer to have do not prefer me. If I had held some places, they would not be knocking on my door on September 1st saying, can we get in? They got in someplace they like better. And as a result, the principals no longer have a reason to withhold places. I'll show you how that played out. But it's also the case that it's now safe for students, for families, to reveal their preferences to the school district. Why is that? Well, remember what made it unsafe about the other systems. It was that if you didn't get your first choice, you might not be able to get your second choice for different reasons in Boston and New York. But now, remember, the algorithm doesn't notice when you apply. So if you don't get your first choice, you have the same chance of getting your second choice as if you had made it your first choice, right? Because when the school finally gets your application, it just looks at how much it likes you compared to the other kids without worrying about when you applied. And so you don't lose your chance of getting into a school by not listing it as your first choice. Yes?
Just to make sure I understand the algorithm.
Yes.
If the school is tentatively accepts a student on the first round, that student might be rejected on the second.
Absolutely.
Because they're in the pool again and reprioritized.
That's right. So supposing I get tentatively accepted in the last place of the school that I applied to on the first round, and you get rejected in the school you applied to on the first round, and now you apply to the school that's holding my application, and they like you better than me. Now I get rejected, and I apply to my second choice. Okay, so, and that's key. It means that if the school gives you a higher priority than me, if they like you more than me, you don't lose that priority just because you didn't list them as your first choice. Okay, so it solves two of the problems. It solves the congestion problem. It solves the making it safe for students to state their true preferences problem. And in addition, it solves the problem in New York of principals withholding places. So in addition, it levels the playing field. Remember the 19% of Boston families that couldn't figure out the system enough to not list as their second choice a school that no one could get as a second choice, which means they wasted their second choice. That doesn't happen anymore. If you happen not to understand how the system works and you just put down the schools you like, it works for you just as well as if you understood how the system worked. So the school district can now safely say, figure out which schools you like and tell us. And it doesn't have to say things like, but don't list a school that's too popular as your first choice. Okay, so it turns out in Boston, other ways of doing this were available that would accomplish the same things, but I'm not going to tell you about them because Boston didn't adopt them. But the reason there were more options in Boston was you didn't have to take care of the principals in Boston. When we came to Boston, we came shortly after helping in New York, and we said to the administrators in Boston Public Schools, we said, how about the principals? Do you worry that they'll withhold places? And they sort of looked at us blankly and they said, we're Boston Public Schools. We tell them how many places they have. So it was a very different world, I think a more usual world as we found as we move in, as we help other school districts in the United States. But in New York, it was definitely the case that the principals were big players and also had to get incentivized to play well. So in Boston, the way we put the issue, though, was we said, would anyone mind if two students who each preferred the schools in the other student's walk zone were to trade their priorities and enroll in those schools? And if they did mind, because of transportation costs or they thought that these weren't tradable, then they should use the system that was used in New York. But if they thought of the school district, of the school assignment problem as only being to get the children where their families wanted them to go, and the priorities were just meant to help that, then we had another thing for them to consider. But in Boston and elsewhere, except in New Orleans, we found that the school districts cared about the priorities they set. That was one of the tools they used to get a distribution of students into schools that they liked. So both New York City and Boston chose a deferred acceptance algorithm, the kind I described to you. In New Orleans, they made a somewhat different choice. But in all these places, what we're doing is we're trying to set up systems that make it safe for families to tell the school district what schools they want. Because if you can't find out what they want, you can't give them what they want. And of course, there's all sorts of other things. As I mentioned in New York, there are exam schools. It's not that you can give everyone what they want. Okay, so in New York City, we put this into effect, and instead of having 30,000 students unmatched, in the end, we only had 3,000 students unmatched. Okay? And of those 3,000 students, we now have had many years of operation in New York City. It's hard to get it down below that. You just can't get preference lists from every student. So you can't put when you can't get preference lists, you can't put every student into a school on his preference list. But an unexpected thing happened. And so I'm now showing you, I'm going to tell you about what happened in the first 4 years and how that changed as people understood the system better. And the important thing to emphasize is we didn't change anything in the first 4 years. So starting in year 1, we did what I just told you. We had a deferred acceptance algorithm. But what we're looking at here is the distribution of how many people got their first choice, how many got their first or second, how many got their first or second or third. And what you see is that in 2004 is the first year we used the deferred acceptance algorithm. Here's 2005, more people get their first choice. More people get their first or second choice. More people get their first or second or third choice. It looks like somehow we have more good places, and indeed we do. Remember those principals who are withholding places. Once they learn that the kids who show up September 1st aren't ones they like better than the ones they can get through the school assignment system, they stopped withholding places. And in the third year, there were even more first choice schools available for people to have, and more first and second choices, and more first, second, and third. And by the fourth year, it had pretty much leveled out. All the school places were now in the centralized system. So that's another mark of success. Not only does it make it simpler for families, it makes it simpler for principals in places where principals have strategic choices to make too. So we've since been, so it turns out the man who was the director of high school operations in New York City when we were doing all this is a man named Neil DeRosen. And he went off with our support. My colleagues in this, my economist colleagues were Attila Abdülkadiroglu and Parag Pathak. And Neil, who was the director of high school operations in New York when we designed the New York system, he decided that he's going to be the Johnny Appleseed of good school choice technology. So with our support, he founded a nonprofit company called Innovation in Public School Choice. And we've now been talking to lots of school districts and hopefully making it easier for kids to get into schools that their families want them to be in. Yes?
What do you say to the criticism of the whole idea of school choice, that it's not really a choice for low-income people because they can't afford to send their kid across town to the school that they would choose?
Right. Well, so if the district, so there are a couple of things that we've seen in different cities. In New York City, they actually don't, for high school students, they don't put on special buses. They give the kids bus passes. So kids have to, so it's not expensive for kids to go, but of course, it might be far. So let me tell you a New York City story. In the first year, we had 6,000 appeals. Okay, so we assign kids to schools, and you get appeals. And the school board tries to figure out which are legitimate appeals and which aren't. But the thing that struck me is 300 of those appeals were from children who got their first choice. So the question is, what was going on? What was going on was transportation. You meet the schools at family education events. I forget exactly what they're called. But you meet the schools at your high school or at some high school nearby. There's a booth from a lot of high schools. And you choose a school, and it turns out it involves changing trains in Times Square and going someplace far from your neighborhood. So now, one of the things that fixed that a little bit is when students choose their schools, if they choose a school that is more than 45 minutes by public transportation from where they are, they get alerted. They can still choose it, but they get told. Now, there are districts in which there would be financial costs to the city or to the parents in transportation. One way schools try to deal with that, school district, is by limiting choice to school districts. So Boston, at the time we did it, this has just changed, but had an East Zone, a West Zone. I forget what the third zone was called. It was probably called the North Zone. And so they tried to, and then Boston put on transportation. They provided school buses. But they tried to limit their costs by saying, if you're in the East Zone, you can only choose schools in the East Zone, except for a few city schools. But that's just about the direct cost of transportation. Let me try to answer your question a little more deeply, because the poorest of the poor sometimes feel disadvantaged by this. And what they say is the following. They say, when everyone goes to a local school district, then all the kids in our neighborhood go to that school, and the kids who we think we represent, who are the kids who don't have a fixed address or for some other reason can't easily participate in this orderly process at the time that it happens, wherever they end up, they go to schools with kids from more organized families. But now, if we live in an area that has really poor schools, the kids from organized families don't go there anymore. Right? The families that are organized figured it out and got out. And that, maybe you're sending our kids to worse schools. So the way the school districts tend to think about that is they say, yeah, but as we make schools smaller, as we make bad schools smaller, they become easier to fix or to close. Closing schools is a different political process than some other things. So in New York City, I graduated from a school that's now categorized as a failed high school. And what that means is that no one may be sent to Martin Van Buren High School, of which I'm a proud alum, if they don't choose it. So everyone in the neighborhood or whatever, if they want to send their kids elsewhere, can. When the school gets small enough, and it's very close to that now, another school can be put into the same building. So there'll be two high schools in the same building. And then what they hope is to make the school better by fixing whatever is wrong where it is now. So that's the hope. But that's a complicated thing. So your question is a good one. I think that's the best answer I could give you. Yes. Yes.
So the parents who could lose English.
Exactly.
Took their kids out, and the failing school became a more failing school.
That's right. But it becomes a smaller, more failing school, and that offers the possibility of fixing it. So fixing. There are, I think in the transition, there are kids still stuck there. That's right. I think that the process in which we are dealing with failing schools does not instantly make them better. But I think it's turned out, at least in New York, that before you can even try to make them better, you have to make them smaller. But it's tough. And again, there are families for whom it's important that their kids are close, and they choose this school. But there are also families who don't really choose it. I mean, the ones I worry about the most are the ones who weren't around when parents were filling out preference lists. But now they're around, and this is where there are spots. Okay, so I think that's what we're seeing in New York. So these are tough problems. Choice is something that can be done quickly. We came in and in a year, they said we need a new choice system, and we helped them do it. And the next year they had a new choice system. It takes longer to make bad schools good. And I'm sorry?
He wants to have the question, people use the microphone.
Oh, okay, that's a good idea.
I was curious if any of your clients had desegregation, racial balancing issues. I'm somewhat aware of a system in LA with their magnet schools,
Yep.
In which a college friend of mine's niece ended up not getting a spot, and they heard about the whitelist, and to do their racial balancing, they actually had to prefer the white student. And how is this may be irrelevant given recent Supreme Court jurisprudence, but is that something you've got any experience with?
It is. So I'm not expert on this because we tend to work at the level of algorithms, but there are a bunch of school districts that have deep concerns and have lots of data about everyone's ethnicity and socioeconomic status. But court decisions have often made it impossible for them to try to choose students on that basis. So you see, so in San Francisco, for instance, which is not a school district where we designed the system, but which we talked to for a while, they give priorities to people by zip codes. So zip codes are, or even smaller than zip codes, by neighborhoods. So neighborhoods are a proxy for all sorts of things, and they have in their objectives all sorts of things. But they lost some court cases years ago. They tried, they have some exam schools in San Francisco, and they wanted Asian students to have higher scores than non-Asian students, and the courts decided that was illegal. So they can't do that anymore, and they're trying to do other things. They're a difficult school district, San Francisco. We didn't succeed in working with them.
I have a question about the Gale Shapley algorithm. It's a famous paper. I'm not sure how quickly it became famous, and also, was it motivated by a problem similar to this, or was it just a theory paper that you found applied to this, or
well,
what was their motivation?
That's a good question, because it's a little of both. The title of their paper was College Admissions and the Stability of Marriage. So they were at least thinking about matching markets, about marriage, about college, and they wanted to talk about this property that when you're through matching, there isn't a student in a school who would both prefer to be matched to each other who aren't matched to each other. And again, you can see that the algorithm has that property, right? Because if some student, let's think about the student. Supposing there's some student assigned to a school he likes less than a school that was higher on his preference list. How do we know that the school doesn't also prefer him? Well, if he's assigned to his third choice school, it means he applied to his first choice and was rejected, and then he applied to his second choice and was rejected. So the only reason he didn't get into his first and his second choice school is they filled their places with students who had been given higher priority, or in New York, who they preferred. So that's the property that Gale and Shapley talked about. And it took many years before we understood how that was related to how matching markets clear in the wild and what we could do to fix matching markets that weren't doing as well as the best one. Picking the microphone.
As I sit here and listen to this, and I've been observing the tremendous hunger for reform of our public schools for the last 10 years since I retired, I think about the realities that I perceive in our population and the system of choice that Adam Smith and the Enlightenment offered us as an alternative to the existing system was certainly an improvement in the 18th century. The realities today are that the people who make choices, all the evidence I've read, and I don't have any kind of expertise in this, seems to show that the most sophisticated people in society use choice as a way to maximize their advantage, and the people who are the least sophisticated and the least prosperous suffer from deficits, some of which are induced by protein deficiency in childhood and others that are induced by high levels of inefficiency among parents in the bottom third, fourth, and fifth quintile of income earners. And I'm just curious if this, and I'm not opposed to school choice. If anything, I favor that because the monopoly of public education and the attitude in particular of public school interests, which includes most public school teachers, has been, the kindest word you can say is resistance to change. But I'm just curious where choice, after everything you've said and explained, I'm just curious when people who start from different starting points have choice, what the end result is 10 or 20 or 30 years. When you were going through this, did you have such discussions about the socioeconomic realities? And I wonder what your take on my limited view of reality is.
Well, we did indeed have discussions, and we found that the adequate data don't yet exist. So my colleagues, Attila and Parag, who are serious, well-equipped economists, they've been using this opportunity that we've been given to get involved in school choice to collect data, not just on school choice, but to follow its effect. So to look at exam scores and high school graduation rates and things like that of the students who get chosen. And one reason why adequate data don't exist is it's hard to figure out the effect of getting a school that you want or of getting a good school because, as you say, the children who go to good schools tend often, for various reasons, to be different children than the children who go to bad school. So that makes it hard to look at the data and say, what's the benefit of a good school? Because you're seeing the good school with the kids whose parents knew about good schools and did something about it. So part of the description I gave you says that when two children have the same priorities, there's going to be a random choice. There's a lottery that determines priority when two kids are otherwise equivalent. There are many, many kids, of course, who are equivalent. Schools don't have detailed preferences by individuals, especially in a place like Boston where there are just very few priorities. So what that means is you can look at random choice between two pretty similar kids who get different outcomes. And that over time, as those data collect, that's going to let Attila and Parag figure out, so how good is it for you to get the high school or the kindergarten that your parents thought you should go to rather than a different one? That's going to take some time, especially for measures like high school graduation, which of course take a long time to accumulate. So I think, though, that while I don't know the answer to your question today, and I don't think anyone knows the answer to your question today, I think that the data that comes from school choice is going to allow us to answer those questions eventually.
I think I have the mic.
You appear to.
So I remember from reading your book in grad school, which was one of my favorite books to read in grad school and has since become one of my favorite books to quote, that the efficiencies that you told us about when individual students, and I remember this with the medical residency program, that when residents can rank medical schools and when medical schools can rank residents, and it all works until two of them are married and care about whether they go to the same one or not, and then it all goes to hell. And
well, not anymore. We fixed that for the doctors.
Okay, well, that was what I was wondering. So there are situations where you can imagine that I care not just about where I go to school, but where my best friend goes to school as well, and that I might care about going with them, more than I care about the relative characteristics of the school. Yeah. And similarly, I could imagine schools who care about mixes of students more than one student over another student, be it for positive reasons that they think that these people would get along well together, or because you want to have two people separated from one another.
Sure, you can't have the Bloods and the Crips in the same high school.
Exactly. So I was wondering, as you moved this from theory into practice, whether you learned about practical ways of solving that problem, and it sounds like...
So that remains a tough problem. There are people here working on that problem in context of auctions, things like that. The place that we see it in a way that we can handle that's a little bit like what you ask about is siblings. Now, part of the story of siblings is easy. In a city like New York or Boston, siblings don't present a hard problem. We're going to give priority to siblings, but because siblings are older, say, than the child going through school, you already know who's a sib. You only have a little bit of a problem with twins, who you have to match at the same time. In New Orleans, it turns out, people don't just move schools at K6 and 9. They move all the time. So in New Orleans, we have something very much like the medical match couples problem, where you might be trying to move your second grader and your fifth grader, and you would like them both to be in the same school. And so that is more like the medical match. Now, the other question you ask, though, is actually beyond the information we think we can get from the schools and from the parents, but that we sometimes see coming up in the wild, which is that every now and then a group of parents in some neighborhood that doesn't have a historically great public school sort of say, why don't we take it back? Let's all send our kids to kindergarten at this school, and then we'll be the school. And you can see that happen, and it works, and they coordinate themselves, but we're not now, the school districts are not now equipped to help them do that.
The school choice algorithm seems like an enhanced version of ranked choice voting. I'm not sure if it is or not, but ranked choice voting has very low acceptance and a lot of critics, and yet the school choice seems to be successful and make everybody better off.
I think of ranked choice voting as being very different. In ranked choice voting, if I understand it, I'm certainly not expert, you're trying to do something like elect a president. And here you're trying to put every child into a school. So they are really different structured problems. It's not that we're trying to have a winner. We're trying to do a match. We're trying to put people into places. So I think of those as almost entirely different problems, although they both involve rank order lists. I think that's about as close as they get.
How about one final question? Is there one final question?
There's questions up at this end of the table, the short end.
Quick last question. It would seem that a lot of people were probably frustrated with the earlier way in which the system worked. The changes that you have made, have you found that has increased enrollment? In other words, I would think that people that were dissatisfied might go private. Has this increased public enrollment?
So that's a good question, which I don't know the answer. By lots of measures, it's increased public satisfaction, right? So a couple of the, some of it's because of the clever things we do, but some of it is because now each kid is admitted to just one school. So I should mention, we didn't want to be known as the group of economists who chased the last middle-class families out of New York City. So one of the first things, so one of the first things we did, right. You know, I'd revel in it, but so one of the first things we did is we looked at those 17,000 kids who got multiple assignments, because that was what was, in a sense, making New York, the process congested, is you were giving families choices to make, and they had to make them at the same time that the schools were being assigned, and that took time. But we thought if there's some group of kids who are getting multiple choices and that really helps them, then maybe that's an important part of the existing process. But when we looked at the kids who got multiple choices, remember, they'd already submitted rank order lists, almost invariably they chose the school that they had said they liked the best. So we realized that it would be enough to give them one admission if we gave it to the school that they liked the best. So so that helped a lot, because there are, along with the things I'm talking about stability, remember, this solves the congestion problem. It used to be 30,000 kids were being assigned in August in New York to schools that weren't on their preference list. Now they're all assigned by May. And so that makes the process of assigning kids to high schools much nicer. So people enjoy it more. They find it less stressful. They still find it stressful. Incidentally, to address maybe the question you asked, you know, as I think about this, one of the things that we start to be able to do, but haven't yet succeeded, is automate a little bit the kind of advice these kids should be getting. You know, the fact that we see now data from school choice means that we might be able to give them advice that they should be getting from their guidance counselors, but aren't always. So when you look at the kids who fail to be matched in New York, you know, there aren't that many, but there's a third round that isn't such a great round to be in. So if you look at kids who fail to be matched in the first two rounds, often they've applied to too few schools or inappropriately. You know, I'm no longer operationally involved in New York City Match, but each year I still get emails from kids who are having trouble with it. And I, you know, sometimes pass them by friends of mine in the New York City school system, and they'll look at the list and they'll say, look at that. He's only applied to 6 schools. None of them have ever taken a kid who is less than a 90 in math, and he's got an 85 in math. Someone should have told him that he has to apply to more schools if he wants to get the schools he wants. So that's the kind of advice we're hoping to automate. If kids aren't getting advice, that's the kind of thing the database could know. And we could say to these kids, add more schools. You haven't listed enough schools yet. So there are a lot of things that make people relatively satisfied with these systems that aren't the mathematical properties of the match, but are the convenience of not having to wait a long time to find out where you're assigned, and making it an easy process to deal. You know, it used to be, excuse me, in New Orleans, they call their process one app, so one application. It used to be you had to go to each school to apply. So it just makes things simpler in lots of ways. So.
I want to thank Al, and thank you very much. I had a couple things about bringing this to a close. One is that Al seems like his voice was failing, but actually I did notice there were still some more questions, and so that reminded me that my friend Victor Fuchs, who had a career as a stand-up comic, he told me that the rule for stand-up comics is quit while they still want more. So that's what we're doing. We're quitting while you still want more.